Good evening and welcome to another episode of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Melissa Whitecross, and I'm streaming to you live from Johannesburg, South Africa. Tonight, Ernst Retief joins us to showcase BirdLife South Africa's science and innovation program's important conservation modeling work and how this is being implemented at various levels of government, local organizations, and the NGO sector. I have a few announcements and some housekeeping before we dive into tonight's talk. Use the Zoom chat room to communicate with us this evening, and make sure that you use the all panelists and attendees option if you want everyone listening to be able to see your message. Questions for our speaker this evening can be posted into the Zoom Q&A box throughout the webinar. And if you're watching us on Facebook Live, a good evening to all of you. You can use the comment feed for your comments and questions. Our speaker will answer these at the end of the webinar. Now you can use the hashtag Conservation Conversations on all major social media channels to let us know that you are tuning in. And you can also catch up on any of our previous episodes via the BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel or our podcast, which is available on all major streaming services. Please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel to help us grow support for our webinar content. Now, a big thank you to all of you who have generously supported these webinars over the past year. I can't quite believe that we are almost at the year mark of Conservation Conversations. Now, to celebrate our year on air, we're giving our listeners a chance to donate and win the incredible Ultimate Companion for Birding in Southern Africa, written by Peter Ginn and Jeff McKilleron. A big thank you to Peter specifically for donating this prize. These books are designed to appeal to the beginner and the advanced birder and contain a wealth of beautifully described birding information that will only add to your Southern African birdwatching experience. Unfortunately, this competition is only open to South African-based viewers, and to qualify, all you need to do is enter April's competition by simply donating at least 100 Rand via the Cricket Donations platform between tonight's webinar and the 30th of April. So for the entire month of April, we will be monitoring our Cricket donations. And if you donate at least 100 Rand, you will qualify for a spot in the lucky draw to win these incredible books. There is no limit on the number of entries, so the more you donate, the better your chance of winning. All you have to do is scan the QR code on the screen using your phone camera or visit the Conservation Conversations webpage to find the link to the donations portal. I will also post the link to the donations portal in tonight's chat box as soon as I'm finished with this intro. Your contributions help us to keep these talks free for all to learn and enjoy, and a big thank you to all of you who have continued to support these webinars throughout the year. Outliers Coffee are roasting for a cause in support of BirdLife South Africa's landscape conservation program and the work that we do to conserve our most threatened birds and habitats in South Africa. Get your very own Dawn Chorus coffee as grounds or whole beans in 250 grams or 1 kilogram packets online today. All you have to do is see the link in the chat box, which will also be posted shortly. You can enjoy the fresh, delicious kickstart to your day that every early birder needs, and proceeds from these sales will go to our conservation work. So we encourage all of our viewers watching to buy their very own Dawn Chorus from Outliers Coffee today. It certainly is the way that I like to start my day. Now, BirdLife South Africa's 5th virtual Learn About Birds conference, or LAB as it's known to most of us, will be running from the 27th to the 28th of May 2021 through the Zoom platform. The deadline for early bird registrations which are cheaper than the standard registrations. This will close tomorrow, the 31st of March 2021 at midnight. So you have pretty much a day to get your registrations in for this early bird rate. Now, registrations can be carried out through the BirdLife South Africa website on screen. Register to attend both Science and Layman's Lab for just 700 Rand. Or if you enjoy these webinars, you can attend only the Layman's Lab lectures in the evenings for a mere 300 Rand. The program for the event is also now available on our lab website and will be mailed out to all of you tomorrow morning. To find out more and to register and pay for this event, please visit BirdLife South Africa's website or email lab2021@birdlife.org.za to find out more. We are really excited to announce our Layman's Lab speakers for this year's event, which will include Dr. Temadayo Osenubi, covering his research into intra-African migrants, the woodland kingfishers. Professor Phoebe Barnard will showcase the risks climate change poses to our 5 fynbos endemics. Etienne Moret is back continuing the debate and discussion on birding ethics. And the discussion was a very important topic which he covered on this webinar 2 weeks ago with my colleague and host, Andrew de Block. So be sure to go and check out that webinar if you missed it on our BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel. And finally, Dr. Anton Wolfart will showcase the Southern Ocean seabirds as we launch into our Flock to Marion cruise build-up of events. Do not miss out on these amazing speakers. Register by tomorrow for just 300 Rands worth of world-class entertainment. You really do not want to miss out on these speakers. And building up through our lab event, our 2021 AGM is going virtual this year and will be held on the 29th of May after the lab conference. To register for this important event, please visit the Flock page under the events tab on our website or email flock2021@birdlife.org.za. Once again, BirdLife South Africa is excited to bring back the Cycle in the Bush Tour, our annual mountain bike fundraising event. Together with Escape Cycle Tours and Abelana Game Reserve, we're pleased to invite you to join internationally renowned commentator Phil Liggett on a 3-day adventure in the gorgeous Abelana Game Reserve in the Greater Kruger region. This is your chance to be part of an exciting, memorable event with the voice of cycling himself, Phil Liggett. We've managed to secure a really great deal this year, so come join us for some great cycling and soul restoring time in the wilderness from Friday 24th September to Monday 27th September 2021. If you'd like to know more, please contact Lindsay Smith at birdlife.org.za and book your spot today. Now, onto tonight's main course. We are fortunate enough to have a familiar Conservation Conversations face returning to your screens. Ernst Retief is our Spatial Planning and Data Manager at BirdLife South Africa's Science and Innovation Program. And I would highly recommend watching Ernst's debut talk last year covering the incredible value of the Southern African Bird Atlas Project, also known as SABAP2, which is available on our YouTube channel. Ernst is one of BirdLife South Africa's top bird watchers and began his birding career when he was still at school. This passion was fueled by Ernst's love of data and analyses as he became intrinsically involved in many of South Africa's citizen science projects, especially the SABAP2 project. Ernst was also the founder of BirdLife South Africa's Secretary Bird Project, and like me, is an absolute secretary bird fanatic, and I'm sure this amazing species will feature in his talk tonight, and we look forward to hearing more. Ernst has been with BirdLife South Africa for more than 10 years, and during this time, he's been involved in expanding the grassland stewardship projects in the Eastern Free State, working with landowners to conserve the biodiversity on their properties. He's also had the opportunity to combine his knowledge about birds with his addiction to information technology and spatial data. Ernst was also instrumental in promoting the use of the mobile app BirdLassa to collect data for the Southern African Bird Atlas Project and to collect point data for our threatened bird species work. During the talk tonight, Ernst is going to discuss how many of these data sets are used to support bird conservation in South Africa. Ernst, it is fantastic to have you back on Conservation Conversations. I'm really looking forward to what you have to share with us tonight. And please, will you switch on your camera and share your screen with all of us? Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for that introduction, Melissa. Let's hope this all works out. See the screen?
We can indeed. Go for it, Ernst. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Melissa, for that really great introduction. And thanks, everybody, for attending. I'm competing with the president tonight, but hopefully you will enjoy the talk and we can have some fun. It's especially great to see all the citizen scientists who have joined tonight and see the comments in the chat box. We see there's lots of atlases, people participating in quack and atlasing and doing all sort of interesting things. So thanks for joining tonight. Right, so let's begin. So the title of tonight's talk is Can Computers Predict the Distribution of Birds? It's a very informal title for a very formal project, but I thought we can have a little bit of fun tonight and try and see if we can answer that question just to make the topic a little bit more interesting. But the fact is that tonight's talk can be very technical. Tonight's talk combines computers, it combines remote sensing data, satellite data, it talks about geographic information systems, It talks about how we can use apps to collect data, technology again. It talks about citizen science data, and then also about birds and their biology and habitat use and so on. So these are all very technical issues, and all these things I just mentioned is something that, or things that I'm really passionate about. I absolutely adore computers, and as you can see, I'm not that young anymore, but from school days, I played around with computers, taught myself programming and so on. I just love computers and what they can do. I had the pleasure to learn about Geographic Information Systems from the first days that they were launched. And, you know, and during all these years, I've always played around with the data, and now I have the opportunity to combine all these interests and in a project at BirdLife South Africa, and combine all these interests to develop bird layers that we can use to conserve birds. But I do accept that this is not everybody's cup of tea, and this subject can be quite technical. So I promise that I'm going to try and keep today's talk as informal as possible. I hope it will not be too informal, and try and keep it not too technical. And on that note, I will just want to mention that I'm not going to talk today about all the statistical analysis that runs behind the models that we develop, and all the thresholds that we apply and how we do that, and et cetera, et cetera. There will be separate workshops that we will have with, for instance, environmental impact assessment specialists, with provincial conservation planners, where we will have discussions about these more technical aspects of the project. In fact, we already had one with people in the wind farm industry, people, EI specialists that work in the wind farm industry. And as I said, we will have more of these workshops for people that are really interested in those more technical aspects of the project. Today, we're going to have a much more informal look into this project. So the agenda of tonight is a brief explanation of how we're going to use computer technology to develop fine-scale habitat suitability maps for birds. So that's basically what we're talking about today, is can we map the habitats that the bird species use using computer technology. We're going to explain why we need these maps, then also how the maps contribute to the conservation of birds, and then lastly, and very importantly, how you can contribute and assist us with this project. I just also want to acknowledge today that I'm using the photographs of Mariki and Albert Fruneman. They are always so keen to share the photographs for us to use, and so I just want to make sure you realize it's not my brilliant photographs, it is that of Mariki and Albert. So I thought let's play a little bit of a game to try and explain what we're trying to do. So let's say it's the days before computers, and when we still worked with paper maps. And you get the challenge to map the distribution of a species, let's say in this example of an orange ground thrush. And how will you go about doing that? You don't have any information, you just have a number of maps. How will you go about mapping the distribution or the habitat that that bird use? So what I want to propose is that in such a case, we go to the literature, and you can go to the Robert 7 text, for example. Now we're talking all about technology, so as you know, you can get the Robert 7 text in the Roberts Multimedia app. So if you go and search for the orange ground thrush, and you go to the text for the species and scroll down, you'll get a screen like the one on the left-hand side, and there's a heading that says habitat. And in there, it describes the habitat for orange ground thrush as moist Afromontane evergreen forest from 750 meters in the Eastern Cape to 1,700 meters in Mozambique. Favors small linear escarpment forest patches along deeply incised drainage lines with perennial streams. And then they even indicate which areas these birds won't use. Avoid areas of dense undergrowth, does not range into adjacent woodland of softwood plantations. Now this is really important, so it tells us the species sticks to natural forest, and it won't go into, for instance, planted plantations and so on. So the question is, if you now have a paper map, can you, for instance, list all the forests that occur in South Africa, which these species might use? Now, we know that in the past we had maps, paper maps, that list, for example, all the biomes of South Africa. So you get a map that will list where are the forests, where are the grasslands, where's the fynbos, savanna areas. There were maps like that, rivers, wetlands. You can get a map like that. And based on the description here, you will be able to draw a line along all the forests in South Africa. It will take you a long time, but you will be able to create a map and draw lines around all the forests in South Africa and say, all right, this is where an orange ground thrush will occur. If you then compare your map to the SAVA2 map that I've got here on the right-hand side, you will note that the forests at the coastal forests are not used by the species. And then if you go back to your habitat description, you'll see that it states there that they only use forest above 750 meters. So they don't use coastal forest. They only use forest above 750 meters. Now your paper map that we're talking about might have, for instance, contour lines on it. And you can then, again, manually decide or remove all the forests that are below 750 meters. And then you are only left with the forest above 750 meters. And that will then provide you with a much more accurate habitat map for orange ground thrush. Now, again, this will take you a really, really long time, for you will have to go and look at all the contours in South Africa and look at all the forests. And it will take you a really long time to identify all the forests above 750 meters. But even after you've done all of this, you might find that your map, and I haven't done this exercise on paper, so I don't know how accurate your map would be, but I'm quite sure you will see that your map might still not be perfect. But this is just to explain you the sort of process that we follow and what we try to do with habitat suitability modeling. So we've now talked about the process that we do by hand. We're trying to do the same sort of thing by using computer technology. And that's the question that we want to answer today. Is that possible? How accurate can we map the distribution of birds or the habitats that they use as computer modeling, using basically the same process that I have just explained? Now, in computer terms, we can try, or let me try and explain it this way. Let's still use our orange ground thrush layer, orange ground thrush example, and ask if we have maps in electronic format that we can feed into a computer that will show all the forests of South Africa. And yes, there are indeed such maps. Just about 2 or 3 years ago, a private company developed a new land cover layer for South Africa. That's what we call that specific data, a land cover layer. And that layer basically indicates for everywhere in South Africa what is the land cover at that specific point. So it can indicate whether there's a forest, whether there's grasslands, whether there's savanna areas, water, rivers, but even unnatural areas like urban areas, mining areas, industrial areas. In fact, there are 72 land cover classes, as we call it, within such a land cover layer. Now, using computer technology and geographic information systems, it would be very easy to load that land cover map into a program like ArcMap or ArcPro or QGIS, and ask it to only create a map for you of all the forests that occur in South Africa. And it would literally take that program a few seconds to create for you a map of all the forests in South Africa. Now, if we compare that to what we talked about earlier, how long it will take you to do it by hand, you can already see the benefit of doing this through computers. They can just do it much better. But as we explained earlier, we just can't use forests to map the distribution of orange ground thrush. We also, for instance, we had to look at altitude or elevation. And again, in computer technology, we've got layers called digital elevation models, or in short, DEM. And these models, basically for every bit of South Africa, will indicate what the elevation or altitude is at that specific site above the altitude above sea level. So it will tell you it is 1,700 meters above sea level or 600 meters above sea level, etc. So there's maps like that available for the whole of South Africa. So now if you take your forest map that we have just extracted from a land cover map, and overlay it with our our elevation map, we can quite easily ask the software to only show us the maps or the forest that are above 750 meters. And again, this process will take literally seconds to be done. However, computers can do much more. In the text that we read in Roberts, it also indicates that orange ground thrush likes to or will occur near drainage lines. Now, I'm not sure, but I'm quite sure you will not get a map that will indicate all the drainage lines in South Africa. But we've got, again, layers, some of them we've developed ourselves, which shows all the major drainage lines in South Africa. And now we can, for example, then also include a layer called drainage lines and combine it with all the other layers to, try and improve the map that we want to create for orange ground thrush. Now, some of you that know about habitable bodies will tell me that I'm oversimplifying things here tremendously, and that is absolutely true. But I just want to make it as simple as possible to explain the thinking about this, how we can use different layers of data to help us map the distribution of a bird species, in this case, orange ground thrush. Now, you might tell me that, Ernst, you've used really easy birds. Forests are, if you look at a map, for instance, in Google Earth, forest stands out. They are totally green. If you zoom into Google Earth, you can quite easily identify forests on a map. It's really easy to identify and to map. But what do you do about grasslands? For the land cover map that I've indicated earlier, grasslands will just be grasslands. They won't distinguish between grasslands with long grasses, short grasses, spare grass areas with just, maybe with bare ground with a little bit of grass. You won't see that in a land cover map. And we know that many of our bird species will use only, you will get a species like Boertaslark, which will use really short grasslands with a lot of open ground cover, with only sparse pieces of grass. Sometimes we say they use overgrazed areas. Ratslark will use, again, short grass with more grass cover than for a Boertaslark, but less, for instance, than a secretary bird. So a secretary bird will walk around in the Roberts, it says, the open grasslands less than 0.5 meters, but there can be a lot more grass cover for a secretary bird that it can use. So how do we plot or consider grasslands if we want to create a map, for instance, for secretary birds or Boertaslark or Ratslark? How do we identify or handle that problem? And this is where we can use all sort of new or relatively new technologies that have become available. And one of these is to use satellite imagery. So for a number of years now, actually for a number of decades, we had satellites taking photographs or imagery of the Earth. There was first Landsat and later Copernicus. And these satellites basically take an image of the Earth every few days. If you, for instance, where your home is today, every few days, 3, 4, 5 days, these satellites will take an image of your home or the farm or property that you live in. And this data, and what's really nice about this, is freely available on a dashboard. You can go on the Landsat or Copernicus database, and you can download the data that this imagery that these satellites take. But they don't take a normal photograph like we take with our cameras. They take different bands of layers of photographs. So they will, for instance, have a layer for near infrared light. They will have one for infrared light and for all different sort of, I forgot the word now. Don't worry, but in other cases, for different light levels and so on, they will take these layers of imagery. And what we now know is that if you combine some of those layers, you can, for instance, quantify vegetation. So you can use that imagery to tell you how much vegetation there is at a specific site. So we call this a normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI. Don't worry about the term, but just to say that through using this, we can plot the amount of plant growth at a specific site. So in the case of grasslands, we would be able to distinguish between the different type of grasslands, but I'll come back to that in the next slide. So the example on the top left shows you an area where we've have run an NDVI index, and the red area would be most probably water or really bare ground, while the green areas in that map will show plant growth. And that's just a map to show you how we, in fine detail, can actually indicate the amount of plant growth at a specific site anywhere in South Africa, and at a specific time, and that's also really important. So if we want to compare this with, let's say, between winter and summer, we can do some interesting calculations. So sorry, let me just go back. I've just lost my train a little bit there. So when we talk about grasslands, we would be able then to use this NDVI index, for example, to look at a grassland, and a grassland that's got very little grassland cover and lots of open ground will have the NDVI value of, let's say, 0.1. So NDVI values can be between -1 and up to 1. And 0 is usually bare ground or water, while 1 is that there's a lot of plant growth. And that's a forest, for example, will have a value of 0.8 to 0.9. But as I said, bare ground will be have a value of 0. So then if we use our examples earlier, we can, for instance, will determine that a boertaslark might use grasslands which have a value of, let's say, between 0.2 and 0.3, while a ratslark might be between 0.3 and 0.4, and secretary birds between 0.5 and 0.6 or something like that. And just as this examples to explain to you how we can use this NDVI index to better understand and plot grasslands and to better map the habitats that these species use in the grasslands. But there are a lot of other layers that we can use to map the distribution of birds. So there are bioclimatic layers. These layers are available. You can go on the internet now and download it if you want to. There's about 18 or 19 of them, if I remember correctly. And they will, for instance, for South Africa, indicate anywhere in South Africa what is the annual rainfall, what is the temperature, average temperature at the site, what is the maximum temperature in winter, what's the maximum temperature in summer, what is the rain and maximum rainfall at a specific site, and all these sort of things. There's a whole range of bioclimatic layers that you can use. For we know that things like rainfall and temperature is all, is important indicators of where, not indicators, but will guide us to better understand where a species can occur. Other things that we can use is topographical layers, for example, slope in a mountain. So for a cliff nesting bird, for instance, we use slope. So we've created a map that indicates all the cliffs, for example, in South Africa. And we can, for instance, ask or create a map where we only indicate where the slopes are higher than a certain gradient. And that we, for instance, then can use to map the distribution of a cliff nesting bird like a Verreauw eagle or a Cape vulture or something like that if we want to build a breeding model. Drainage lines, as I said, we've already explained earlier that we've also developed a layer for that. And then there are layers, standard layers available for soil type. And we are quite amazed how many times soil type comes up as an important, important factor to, to predict where a species occur. Then I've already discussed land cover. So this is where we have mapped, indicated where there are forests and grasslands and so on. And then we've got our remote sensing indices where NDVI layers, which I've just explained to you, is one of the layers that we can feed into these models. But there's no big difference. One big difference to our example that we played with around earlier, we use Robert's multimedia text. Now, we can't feed Robert multimedia text into a computer. We need to somehow find another way to tell it where a bird species occur. And that is where we use sample data, which is basically point data, which is point data for where we know a bird have been seen. So if we use our example of orange ground thrush, we will use data where somebody has seen an orange ground thrush in a forest. We'll take the exact latitude and longitude where that bird species was seen, and we will feed that into our computer model. So what the software will then attempt to do, so in the example, in the image on the left, the point data is in the top. So let's say that little dot there on the top is the point data for our species. So we know the species occur at little dots. And at each dot, the computer program will then look at all the layers that we fed into it and get the land cover value, the elevation value. It will determine how far it is from a drainage line, what is the average temperature, what is the average rainfall, and all the other layers that we have input into the model. And it will do the same thing for all the other points that we have. So in that way, we train the model and tell it what is the habitats and the climatic variables that the species use, or that will predict its distribution or its habitat preferences. So again, if you have to do this by hand, it will basically be impossible, but it is actually quite easy to do that in computer programs. And that's the benefit of using computers to do this sort of analysis for us. So just to get to the formal definition then, so what we're trying to develop is habitat stability models. It's also sometimes called species distribution models, but we've decided we want to use the term habitat stability model. And as it's described, the habitat stability model make use of computer algorithms to predict the distribution of a species using various environmental data, such as temperature, land cover, slope, soil, and soil type, etc. And what is really nice about these models that we develop using all these layers in technology is that we also can try and predict what will happen in future when, for instance, climate change plays a role. What will be the impact of climate change on the distribution of a species? We can ask a computer to predict us what that should be. So what are the steps to develop these habitat suitability models? So the first thing is that we need to obtain sample point data. And this is where things like BirdLife comes into play. So I'm really glad that years ago, when BirdLife started, I talked to Henk Nel from BirdLife, and we launched a threatened species course from BirdLife. So that is where a birder can go on the app and click a box, and by clicking on that box, the atlaser or the birder agree that when he lock a threatened bird species, that we can access that data. So if you're in the field with your BirdLife app and you see secretary birds, you can lock the secretary bird, and what we ask is that people lock the bird as near to the point where they've seen it. And that data then syncs automatically to the BirdLife database, and I can then go to a dashboard where I can download that specific location data. And we now have a database for a number of, it must be over 50,000, even more bird sightings of threatened birds that have been collected during the years by this threatened species course. And we can now use that point data as the sample data for these models that we're developing. Other data sources that we use is specialist data. You might have a student that, for instance, is doing his PhD on a threatened bird species. So that person might have breeding records for species and nest sites and so on. And we then, for example, can use that data as sample point data if we, for example, want to build a breeding model for a specific species. But it's really important for us that you then need to vet this data that we receive to make sure that it's accurate, and it also must be prepared. You just can't take all the data that you receive from BirdLife and put it into the model. For that, we'll skew the data. We need to ratify the data for, if there's a lot of data at one point of the species distribution, but very few data sample points in another part of the bird's distribution, then it will skew the data. So we need to ratify the data, consider the spread of the points, and really consider which point data we will be feeding into that model. So this is quite a time-consuming process, and we're talking here about hundreds of points. But we have managed to create some interesting tools to help us to do the ratification of the data, but still it takes quite a while. Then we need to consider the base layers that we want to use. And one thing that we do, and what we feel very strong about, is that we will only use base layers based or considering the biology and the habitat use of a bird species. We could quite easily have just used all the same layers for all threatened bird species in South Africa, and that would make it a lot easier for us, but that would just not be the best way to do this. So if we have a model that we're developing for a cliff nesting bird, as I explained earlier, we will include slope, but we will not include slope when we, for instance, build a layer for a water bird, let's say like a pygmy goose. Slope won't make any sense if we use that for a water bird species. But again, if you build a model for a Cape vulture, including water, for instance, won't make sense. So we carefully consider the base layers that we will feed into these models. We then take all this data and we feed it into software. So currently we use MaxEnt. So there are various software that we're using, but we are currently using MaxEnt. And then we run this model. Now this can take several hours for it to really hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of calculations that MaxEnt need to do. And here at BirdLife South Africa, we bought a little bit of a high-end PC to help us. And even so, it can take sometimes 5 or 6 hours for such a model to run and to complete. After the model has run, we analyze the graphs and statistics. That's an output of the models. On the top left-hand corner is one of the graphs that we use, which then the MaxEnt program then tell us basically how well the model performed. And that will give us a first indication whether our base layers and sample data is actually the correct, and if the model output is correct. It's just a first indication of that. But we then need to do further validation, and this is where SABAP2 data comes into play. For we then can overlay the model with our SABAP2 data and just do a scan and check to see if the model highlighted all the areas where we've got known occurrence of the species, where the species have been recorded in SABAP2. And if not, we need to try and explain. Sometimes you'll have a vagrant record for a species far away from the core range from the bird. And so it's just a vagrant bird that moved to an area recorded by SABAP2, but the bird doesn't regularly occur there, and therefore the model did not pick up that specific area. And then the second thing we want to do is on-the-ground validation, is so to go with our maps to a specific site, look at the area identified by the model as valid for that species, see if the species occur there, or if it's not there, whether the habitat there is actually suitable for that specific species. Then we need to consider thresholds, and I don't want to talk too much about that now, but you need to analyze the data to determine what threshold you're going to apply. So as I said, that's quite a complicated issue, and I don't want to discuss that tonight into much detail. And after you've done all of this, you might realize that your model is not perfect, that you can improve on it, that you maybe need to remove some layers, add some layers, your point data is maybe you need to make changes, and that means that you need to rerun the model, and again you'll have to wait 5 or 6 hours for the model to run. So it is quite a time-consuming process, but still way faster than what we can ever dream to do by hand or in any other way. So the final product looks something like this, and as I said, I again don't want to go into much detail. but it will create a map like the one on the left, which is what we call a raster file. So basically a raster file is like a photograph where every pixel in the map's got a value. So in this case, our raster files for this product is 1 hectare plots, and each 1 hectare plot will have a value between 0 and 1. And for values near to 0 will show that the habitat is not really suitable for that species, while values nearer to 1 will show that that habitat is really suitable for that species. So in this case, in the map there on the left, we have a model for rat's lark, and you can see clearly which areas the model have identified as really important for rat's lark, but it also then identified some areas which is not suitable or less likely that you will find the bird there, and then areas where the bird will not occur. That's the white areas, which is not indicated by the model at all. So just to say that this data, raster data, can be uploaded into any program like ArcMark, ArcPro, or QGIS. QGIS is free open source software that you can download. So it's not that difficult to use the map, but to analyze and to interpret the map is quite a complicated process. And that's why we will have separate workshops where we will explain to AI specialists and so on how they can interpret and use these maps. So you might ask me, why do we need these fine scale distribution maps? Don't what we have out there is good enough? And in your Roberts multimedia, you would see these distribution maps, but I think you will agree if you look at that map for Vero Eagle that it's very broad. There's many areas in there where the species won't occur. And then we can talk about suburb 2 maps. Now, when we started with, or when I started working at BirdLife South Africa about 10 years ago, I was really disappointed to learn that the conservation planning community in South Africa cannot use suburb 2 data. They do use point data for birds, and they did build a few of their own models. But at that time, we had already millions of records, accurate vetted records in the suburb 2 database, but they could not use the data for conservation planning purposes. And I was really disappointed, for I know how hard we all work to collect this data, how much money atlases are spent to collect the data, money and time. I mean, it is really, Atlas have spent millions of rands during the years to collect this data. And so I was really disappointed to see that this data are not used in conservation planning. So I've always looked forward to a solution or a way how we can change that and how we can incorporate data into conservation planning. And I'm happy to say that we've now managed to do that. So why could they not use suburb 2 data? And it's all to do with resolution. So the planning units that conservation planners, for example, as I say, provincial conservation planners use, and I don't want to go in details as to how they run their models and the conservation planning software works and so on, but they use planning units. And those planning units are really small. So on the left-hand side map, top one is the planning units they use for Mpumalanga. So you can see it is these little squiggly polygons. And there are tons of them in one pentad, one atlas block. So I hope everybody that's attending tonight know that we collect data for the suburb 2 project in blocks, atlas blocks called pentads. They're about 7 by 8 kilometers in size. So it's quite a big area. And as I say, within that atlas block, there are a lot of these planning units. Other conservation planners use those little hexagons in the bottom map. And again, you can see there are a lot of those hexagons in one pentad. And what a conservation planner needs to know is exactly in which planning unit the atlases saw that specific bird species. That's what they need to know. And with the current suburb 2 data, we can't tell them that for. We just know that the secretary birds, for example, have been seen within that atlas block. But on the right-hand side, we can now, that's again the example is rat's lark. We can show them the suitable habitat used by rat's lark within a pentad. So we can be quite confident that the birder that logs the data for or submitted an atlas card for that area, log rat's lark in one of those blocks areas that we have identified within each pentad. And now you can see if you now overlay those planning units with that identified areas, the conservation planner can allocate a planning unit to a specific habitat area, and they are quite happy that that is then fine scale enough for their purposes. So there's a document called Technical Guidelines for CBA Maps, and in there they state certain criteria that conservation planners can use, and one of that it should be actual occurrence data. So that is what SABAP 2 is. SABAP 2 is actual occurrence vector data. We know the species occur there, but that the data must also be fine scale. So by combining our fine scale habitat suitability models with the SABAP 2 data, we can now actually feed SABAP 2 data into conservation plans, which is a massive win for us. So how will this data be used? And again, this can be a talk on its own, but just to say that we've got excellent conservation planning tools in South Africa, and all based in legislation. And one of these tools that the conservation planners develop is called Critical Biodiversity Area Maps, or in short, CBA maps. So those planning units that I showed you earlier, they will for each planning unit indicate if that area should remain as a CBA 1 area, as a critical biodiversity area, meaning that it should remain natural. It's an irreplaceable area. It is really important for the conservation of biodiversity, not only birds, but for all biodiversity, and therefore it should remain as a CBA 1 area, and ideally mining applications or development should not take place in those CBA 1 areas. But the problem is, up to now, as is explained earlier, very little bird data feed into this process to create these CBA maps. And that is now the situation that we want to correct. We want to provide them with these fine scale maps that then can feed into CBA maps, and that we will have improved CBA maps. And these maps, as these maps feed into all our biodiversity sector plans, bioregional plans, provincial conservation plans, it would be really a great win for us if we can do that. For then, all these plans basically decide or set out how land is managed in South Africa. And if we can make sure that areas where our threatened bird species occur are listed as CBA maps, that will help us to make sure that those areas remain natural, and that suitable developments will not take place in those specific areas. Another recent thing that happened is that the Department of Environmental Affairs launched a national screening tool, which is absolutely fantastic. So basically, environmental impact assessment specialists are now forced, when they are evaluating a development, to go to the site screening tool, log in, and indicate their footprint of their development on a map. And then the tool will create a report for them of all the threatened bird species and habitats and water resources. There's lots of layers in the specific screening tool. That report will then highlight to them and say, look, at this site which you are considering for development, there are these 10 threatened bird species that occur there. These are these 10 or 6 threatened mammal species, butterfly species. This is a threatened habitat type that occur at this specific site. So the developer, if you do that, will immediately know, oh, if I'm going to develop here, I'm going to run into a lot of trouble. I'll have to, I'll have to jump through a lot of hoops to get my development approved. So we have now already included a lot of our models that we developed, 38 of them, in this tool, and I will soon develop or submit in the next 2 or 3 weeks a number of models that we will also feed into this tool. So I just want to tell the atlases in this group and to the people that submit to Citizen Science, your data that you contributed now feed directly into this national screening tool. So the data that when you log the secretary bird, it helped us to create the layers that will feed into the screening tool. So if somebody wants to go and develop at a site where you've logged a secretary bird, this tool will flag the fact that there's a secretary bird there, and the environmental impact assessment specialist will then have to consider that when they consider the development application for that specific area. So I think that's a massive win for us and really important. Another thing we want to do is to highlight or identify gaps into the CBA network and our protected area network. So this is just a case study. So red lark is endemic and threatened bird species in South Africa. Its core distribution is in the Northern Cape. So you can see I've loaded the distribution or the habitat suitability model in the map there. And the red areas of the explained area shows the core distribution or core habitats for red lark in the Northern Cape. But you can now see the other areas there. The purple areas show the CBA areas, and the green areas is the formal protected areas in the Northern Cape area. And you can see that that core area of red lark is basically not covered currently by any CBA or protected areas. And this is what we want to do, this is the thing that we want to correct. We want to provide the conservation plan in Northern Cape with this data so that they can rerun the analysis and see maybe some of these areas will then in future become CBA1 areas. And the exciting thing is that the conservation planner of the Northern Cape told me that in about a year or two, they're going to rerun their conservation plan for the Northern Cape. So if we get all our ducks in a row, or all our species list or species maps correct, and we're providing with the layer, you will include all of this data into the next conservation plan. And then hopefully this map will look a lot different, and a lot of these areas will then be flagged in the conservation planning tools that's available. Again, a really, really big win for us. This is just an example to show you how environmental impact assessment specialists can use the data. So this is again the map for Rats Lark I showed to you earlier. So if you indicate the footprint of the bits of your development over the map. So let's say they want to build a wind farm north of Wakkerstroom, and that is what the footprint of the map will be. The EIA specialist will immediately see that the western part of the development contains habitat, which the model shows is really contains habitat for the for Rats Lark. This is really important for that bird species, and they should consider that when they evaluate this development, this wind farm development for that specific area. But it will show that on the eastern part is maybe not habitat for that species, but they will then also have to look at other bird species, threatened bird species in that area, look at that maps and overlay all of them and see what's the impact of development on all of these species. And this is just a very basic example to show how how EA specialists can use this data. And I'm really glad to say that we already have a number of EA specialists that's using this maps precisely for this purpose, especially in the wind farm industry. I've just this week again provided EA specialists with some maps for black harrier, Rats Lark, Botha's lark, and other species. So already this data is being used exactly as I have described here. And I'm nearly to the end of my talk. Other uses of it would be for climate change studies. As I said earlier, we can use these same models to predict how species distributions might change over time due to climate change. So currently, a lot of our conservation planning concentrate on where birds are now, but we need actually to determine where birds will be in 30, 50 years or 70 years time. Otherwise, birds will have nowhere to move if the planet gets hotter and rain, or rain patterns change and so on. So we need to look at where birds will occur in 20 or 30 or 40 years times, and we can use these models to do that. We can also do connectivity studies. So one of the big problems we have with the way that we conserve species is that we have all our protected areas, nature reserves and national parks, but they are not linked to each other. And for species to survive, they need to be able to move between protected areas. And we can use these models and these similar tools to identify corridors between protected areas or CBA areas and so on. and then also our conservation planners to consider those corridors, and we need to protect that corridors from unsuitable development. We can also use it for protection status of birds. So in the past, I've did a study to indicate how well our birds are conserved. So how well are they protected by our full protected area network. But I could only use SABAP2 data, and as I said, it's quite coarse. But now I can actually use this model data together with SABAP2 data to do a much better analysis. And it will then also indicate to us gaps into our protected area network. And then we can try and influence government to say, look, here are gaps, and can we please consider a biodiversity stewardship project, for example, in that area, because it's a really priority area for birds, for example. So lastly, how can you contribute to this project? First of all, you can join the threatened species course on BirdLife. So if you use the app, just go to settings and to courses, and you'll see there's the threatened species course. Click on that little red tick box, and you will be asked if you give us permission that we can use your data. We're not only getting your data, but also your email address and telephone number and so on with its own email address. And as you know, there's legislation these days that protect your information. So you need to give us permission that we can access your information. But I want to ask you that you should only join this course if you're prepared to log species as near as possible to where you're seeing them. So most people log the birds on the road where you stand. Is naturally where you log the birds. But the app makes provision that you can actually move the site into exactly where you can see the bird. And that will help us a lot if atlases and birders would be keen to do that. But if you haven't, if you haven't joined the threatened species course, please consider doing that. And then secondly, submitting data to SABAP2. And the really important thing is that we need to get better data for SABAP2 all over South Africa, especially the pentads with only 1 or 2 lists, the yellow and orange pentads. We need to get more data. For the more pentads we get where threatened bird species are recorded, the better we can report to the conservation planners. And for instance, that site screening tool that I talked about earlier, I don't want to go in detail, but it's really important. I can give a higher sensitivity value if I can show that the species have been recorded during SABAP2 than for an area that's modeled where the species have not been seen in SABAP2. So if we can get better distribution data for a species on SABAP2, that helps us a lot, and it will improve our database. One thing that we're considering doing in future is also to ask Atlas to visit specific pentads to look for a species. So for instance, again, that map is just north of Wakkerstroom. The black squares indicate where ratslark have been seen. And you can see there's one square where it's clear that there are suitable habitat for ratslark in that pentad, but it's not been recorded by SABAP2. And it's most probably because there's not access to a property, there's not a road that's running through the area. But if we can identify these areas, maybe we can identify the landowner, the farmer whose property overlaps with one of those red areas, and we can try and go and find that species and create an atlas card and then submit the data, and that will then improve our atlas data. So that is one thing that we will consider doing in future to notify to atlases which pentads it should be priority pentads for us to atlas and so on. But yeah, in general, please just go out, participate in the project, join the course on BirdLife. As I said, all this data are so valuable, and we're trying our best to feed this data into our conservation planning tools and in order to conserve the birds that we have in South Africa. So in conclusion, I think this is a really exciting initiative which can potentially contribute significantly to the conservation of birds, and especially the way land is managed for priority areas. And we will continue developing this project. It's a long-term project. And in that regard, I would like to thank ICAPA, who've provided significant funding to support us. And Esther joined our talk tonight. Esther, thank you very much. And thanks to ICAPA for supporting us financially, also for RMB that have supported me for many years and also this year. and also the Fort Wildlife Foundation, which have provided me with a vehicle for many years. Without these sponsors, we can't do this work. It is time consuming. It is, we need extensive resources to do this analysis and this work. And we really need our funders to do this work. So thank you to each one of them. Melissa, I think that is it.
Ernst, thank you so much. I think you did a fantastic job of breaking down a very technical subject and really showcasing some of the innovative work going on behind the scenes in the conservation sector. So thank you so much for that. Before we jump over to our questions, just to remind everyone that as you exit the webinar, there will be a post-webinar survey. It takes about 2 minutes to complete, so please do take the time to just fill that in for us. And a reminder that next week, Trevor Hardiker is going to be joining us to showcase the West Coast National Park as part of our Sand Parks Showcase talks at the beginning of every month. So be sure to tune in and join Trevor for this exciting and beautifully visual talk. It's going to be a lot of fun. Ernst, we've got a lot of different questions here. I'm going to try and get through as many of them as I can. I am conscious of time, but just a first one, and I think something our more bird watching enthusiasts will be interested in, and Willie Victor has asked this question. Are these distribution maps going to be available to birders, and how will they be able to use them going forward?
Yeah, so I was wondering if we're going to get this question. So I don't know, we haven't talked about making the maps available to the general public. One of the big concerns that we have these maps is how they will be used. We have learned through the years that if you provide a map like this to people, that it can be incorrectly interpreted. And so currently for people to use the data, they need to sign a data sharing agreement with BirdLife South Africa. And they agree then through that agreement that they understand how the models should be interpreted. For what I haven't mentioned really is that this is just model data in many respects. So it's not perfect and it's under development on a continuous basis. So for instance, if the AI specialist wants to use it, we still expect them to go on ground level and check the data. They just can't use the model data and say, all right, now we've done our EA assessment and we're not going to do any on the ground assessments. So currently for people to use the data, we require data sharing agreements and so on. But we'll see, we hope to later on have an online tool where we will host all this data, and maybe we can make it available in some sort of format that will also benefit birders. But we don't, currently, I don't see a way that we really can do that.
Thanks, Ernst. And then Arno Elmers asked whether you know of any other countries, either in Africa or further afield, that are using similar types of techniques where you're taking conservation models and overlaying it with products like SABAP to verify some of the data that you're producing with these models.
So I'm not aware. I know that, so the modeling thing that I've explained today, the modeling process is widely used throughout the world. That is well established in literature. Lots of scientific papers have been written about it during the years, and because of that, the process has been improved. So the modeling approach has been used widely. I'm sure that there will be other areas in the world where they, for instance, overlay this data with eBird data or other citizens and science data. So it is possible. We are also considering expanding this project into Africa. So I know Melissa can chat to you about it, how we use it for southern-banded snake eagle. Already developed a model looking at the larger Southern Africa area. Also for white and flufftail, my previous colleague, Robin Collane, developed a model for them. So we can do this sort of analysis for the larger South Africa. So yes, it's totally possible, but the larger area means more sample data that you need to feed in, more base layers, more computing power. So it is totally possible, but it becomes quite time consuming if you want to do it at such a large scale.
Absolutely, and hopefully we'll be bringing everyone some info on the southern banded snake eagle a little bit later in the year's program of conservation conversations, and we look forward to showcasing some of that work, Ernst, that we've been working on. We've got a question here from Chris Williams-Wynn, and it's great to have Chris with us. He's the Surveyor General for the Eastern Cape, from what I could see on his comment there in the question and answer box. So thanks, Chris, for tuning in today. And he's made a really interesting point with regard to the resolution that these satellite images collect data. Now, I know you touched on this, Ernst, but we know there's many, many different products out there. And when they take photographs of the Earth's surface, they can do this at varying sizes. Now, often what happens is the more fine scale we go, the more expensive those products get. And I think it's definitely a good platform just to appeal to some of the bigger global information systems guys, saying that we in conservation are obviously working really hard to understand what's going on with our species, but there's a very clear barrier in trying to access some of this really fine scale data that we need. And Chris has made the point here in the question and answer box that some of these free products are sitting at sort of 100 meters by 100 meters, so a hectare per pixel, which isn't always going to be a sufficient size when it comes to trying to make decisions in the development space. But if we can get down to the 20 by 20 meter products that Copernicus and some of the other Sentinel satellites are putting out, that would definitely be a lot more accessible. And in your experience, Ernst, how have you found getting access to these fine scale products? Have you found it a challenge, or have you been granted access to some of these more exclusive products?
Yeah, so we can actually access the Copernicus data at 20 meter. I think it might be 10 meters, or I might be under correction. 20 meters. The only reason why we use 1 hectare is because of computing time. If you use the 1 hectare for the whole of South Africa, as I said, it already takes 5, 6, 7 hours to run that model based on a 1 hectare resolution. If you want to do it for smaller areas, it just becomes, it will literally, we have tried it in the past, and it will run for hours and hours and hours to do the calculation. And we ask ourselves the question if the advantage that we will get with fine scale resolution data will be that much better, you know, is it worth the effort? And what we decided is rather for certain projects, like let's say we've got a wind farm development and they want a fine scale model for that specific wind farm development, then we can run the models at a smaller or a finer scale. But at this level where we work with the whole country, we feel that a 1 hectare might be good enough. Yes, for some forests, for instance, we sometimes get forest patches which are smaller than 1 hectare, or the blocks that we work in will just overlap, you know, between a grassland and a forest. But it's really quite pedantic if we want to go into, you know, that small detail. But yes, so in short, the data is actually available. The Copernicus data at 20 meter, as I said, might be 10 meter, but maybe 20 meters, so we can actually use it. But we've just decided to stick to 1 hectare because of practical reasons, but it is possible to go smaller. Yeah, so as you say, there's other products that you can buy that goes down to centimeters. They, you know, these, I forgot what they call it now, where they fly a plane and take, you know, imagery, the same sort of things that satellites do, that goes down to centimeters. It's really crazy what you can determine from that. But yeah, then you need lots of money in order to obtain those data.
Absolutely. And on average, Ernst, with these models that you've been producing, what is the average runtime out of interest for everyone listening? How long does it take to produce a single model?
So just running it, as I said, can be anything between 3 to 6 hours. I had one the other day that ran right through the night, and I later realized it should not take that long. I made a mistake. So usually it will be anything between 3 to 5 hours. But if you then consider that before that you need to prepare the data, that sometimes can take a whole day or two to prepare the sample data and so on. So it takes really a long time to prepare the data, run the data, and then you still need to do the evaluation of the data. And I then also need to create the metadata that we feed into the site screening tool, for example. So that's another process where they require fields that needs to be added for each polygon in the file, or the raster needs to create, you know, to be converted to a polygon file, and now I need to create all the standard columns that they require in the metadata table and create codes. So there are all these sort of things that needs to be added, and that also takes some time, but that I've automated a lot. So that already also helps. So yeah, it's quite a time-consuming process. And if you think we've got over, 80, 90 threatened bird species, terrestrial threatened bird species in South Africa, and we also want to create maps for the endemics, we're talking over 100 species that we eventually want to create maps. So it is a really, really big and long-term task.
Absolutely, but a very valiant and needed task. So thank you, Ernst, for championing this cause. We really are very, very grateful to you for doing what you do. We got a comment here from Eleanor Mary. And she's saying your work clearly provides a vital resource for the conservation of the environment and the listing of biodiversity areas. And she wants to know, are species other than birds, so the likes of mammals and insects, included, thus securing the area as an important one for biodiversity? Or are there other organizations who are providing this kind of information? So I know you mentioned the site screening tool. Would you like to give a little bit more info on some of the other biodiversity that's being included in that, please?
Yeah, so we closely work on this project with the Endangered Wildlife Trust. So they are developing the same sort of models and products for other taxa like butterflies, reptiles, mammals. I can't remember exactly all the taxa that they are working on, but they are really working hard to develop these same sort of layers for the site screening tool. And that's also already available in the site screening tool. And then SANBI provided all the plant layers and vegetation layers into the site screening tool. And as I said, then there's already a lot of other layers like water layers, you know, what's the water catchment areas and rivers and wetlands. And even agricultural areas that's important for agriculture and so on. You don't want necessarily people to go and build a shopping complex on an area that's really important for agricultural purposes. So all of that is built into this site screening tool. And what I haven't explained earlier is that for each one of these taxa, there's not each one, but for some of these taxa for birds, there's guidelines that explain exactly what sort of monitoring people need to do if the site screening tool highlights that there are, for instance, a black area at a specific site. It will request or guide the EI specialist what sort of monitoring he then needs to do at that specific site. And we're going to do separate guidelines for vultures. There's already one for black harriers, I think for bearded vulture, if I'm correct. And we're working on one for vultures and so on.
Absolutely, and I think it's so amazing how your layers are finding their way into all of these different developmental industries. And I did see a question in the question answer feed. Let me just find it here quickly from Mel van der Spey, talking about how these distribution maps are influencing wind farms and how they're affecting birds. And I actually spent most of my morning today in the Birds in Renewable Energy Specialist Group meeting, which is organized by Samantha Ralston Payton, our Birds in Renewable Energy Project Manager. And it's fantastic to see how our environmental specialists are using these maps to really guide a lot of their work and help inform developers and interested parties who are looking to invest in South Africa as a development nation. They're able to use these maps, and before a single dollar is really spent on the ground building any of these developments, your maps, Ernst, are able to help inform where there are going to be issues going forward, and it saves everyone a lot of time, money, and headaches, and really keeps our biodiversity safe. So I don't know if you want to add anything more to that.
No, absolutely. You're spot on. And as I said, currently there are quite a few specialists that have already signed data sharing agreements with us. Specialists who work in the wind industry, and as I said earlier, we already had a workshop with them to explain them the value of the maps and how it should be used and so on. So they're one of the first industries that are actually using these maps.
Absolutely, and we're really grateful for the relationship that we have with the wind energy industry. Now, I think we've got time for one more question, Ernst. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to get to everyone's tonight, but this one's coming from Robin Hurd, and Robin's asking, do you include food availability in your models? So the example that Robin's provided is the Cape vulture needs carcasses, especially crushed bones, to survive. So our Magaliesberg colonies survive because they're fed and the bones are crushed by humans, but obviously there's no more hyenas to do this kind of task. But how do you factor in life history into these models, or is it more to do with the ecology of a species and what it needs from the environment? Would you just talk to that point a little bit more, please?
So I actually would love to include that, but in order to do that, you need a map or you need data to help you guide that. So one of the things that we, for instance, can look at the vulture restaurants or the vulture feeding areas in the country, where are they located, and maybe some of that can help us to, I'm not sure that we can include it as a base layer. But yeah, for many species, I sometimes thought if we can have, if we know that they use a specific, food source, that if we get a map of that specific food source, it will help us to guide, and we can feed that as a base layer. But the problem is we don't have those data, and that is one of the frustrations maybe with the project, that we sometimes can think of base layers that we can feed, but we just don't have the data to support that. The one thing that I want to maybe just quickly mention is that these maps also not always consider what we call abiotic data. So that is the impact of humans, for instance, on an area. So let's use a really good example. If a landowner shoots all the Vero eagles on his property, I don't have a map to show where all the landowners, shoot all the Vero eagles, if you understand what I mean. So the map will show that that property is suited for Vero eagles, but there might not be any because they've been prosecuted or something like that. So that's why I say these models are a really good beginning, and it shows suitable habitat, but there are certain factors that we cannot calculate. And especially abiotic things like the impact of humans is difficult to do. Although we've got a layer that indicates the distance from transformed areas, so instance, distance from a city. And we found some species where that layer played a really big role. So some species don't like to be near cities, and the model will then immediately pick that up. Other species don't mind being in cities, and then the model pick that up. So we can do a little bit of that, that sort of analysis, but we cannot consider all the factors that plays a role.
Absolutely. I think with that, Ernst, I'm going to say thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fascinating talk. I know one of our more technical talks, but it's so wonderful to see some of the really innovative work that BirdLife South Africa is involved in. And kudos to you and the science and innovation team that have been behind creating these incredible layers that are going to definitely be the base layers for taking a lot of our conservation work forward. So Ernst, I don't know if you have any last comments you'd like to share with anybody before we close off for the evening.
No, thanks. I see some of the questions here. I don't know if I'll be able to get access to the questions and know who to respond to, but I would really like to provide answers to some of these questions. So I don't know if that would be possible. Otherwise, people can email me and I will gladly respond to the questions. Just Ernst Retief at birdlife.org.za. I see there's some really technical and interesting questions and really valuable questions. So, but thanks. It was really great to be here.
Absolutely. We'll share those questions with you, Ernst, with pleasure, and we'll make sure that you can get everybody feedback that we weren't able to address during the live session here. A big thanks to everyone who stuck around to the end of this talk. I hope that you have enjoyed another one of our conservation conversations. Keep your eyes on the skies and keep enjoying those birds. We'll be back next week, Tuesday, with that exciting talk from Trevor Hardiker. So this is Melissa Whitecross signing off tonight, and thank you so much, Ernst, for joining us this evening. We'll see you all next week, everyone. Keep safe and good night, and happy Easter to all of you if you are celebrating it this weekend. Good night, everyone. I'll leave the chat room open for a few more minutes if you would like to leave any last comments. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.